welcome everybody. My name is Mikhail. I'm a professor of political science and international affairs here at GW's political science department at Elliott School, and also the Institute for European, Russian, Eurasian Studies, and as co-director of PONARS Eurasia, together with my colleague Marlene and Laruelle, who chair the first panel. Very happy to welcome you to this morning's discussion, which will be the first of a whole day of what should be really interesting, rich discussions about important topics related to the post-Soviet world. Let me just say a few words about kind of PONARS Eurasia, what it is, and how the topics and how the panels are organized. PONARS was basically founded as the Program on New Approaches to Russian Security in 1996 and 1997 in collaboration between Carnegie Corporation of New York and Celeste Wallander when she was at Harvard University, and since then it's kind of evolved, and in 2009 we were here. And it has two core missions. One is to connect scholars who are working on the region amongst themselves, in particular connecting those academics in the United States and North America more generally with academics based in the former Soviet countries. Over time people have moved to different countries, so we have a large representation from Europe right now as well. So very happy to say that, despite all of the very difficult moments in relations among these countries, we've managed to sustain a very strong community of scholars who identify primarily as scholars, and therefore have been able to sustain a constructive dialogue despite tensions that have disrupted sometimes families or Facebook unfriending and everything like that. We very much valued that part, and the collaboration, I think, has helped enrich all of our research over the years. But the second the second but not less important mission of PONARS is to help better connect the worlds of academia and the worlds of policy. For those of you familiar with the academic world, the incentives given to professors, especially junior professors, are not always conducive to making your findings kind of accessible to outsiders outside of the academic community. And so part of the idea from the beginning was to provide various platforms through which scholars could be encouraged to try and distill the important findings of their research that might be relevant to the policy-making community. And a very important part of that is actually being in dialogue with people who are interested in policy and working in the policy community themselves to get their feedback, which can help enrich our research, and also to find out what kinds of questions will be useful. And so the result, I think, has been a very interesting and productive dialogue over the years. And the annual DC Policy Conference has always been kind of the main event that PONARS has organized over the years, although now we do kind of many other types of events. And related to that, the policy conferences are structured around the presentation of policy memos, which are kind of the written products designed to try and distill academic research to more policy, for use in more policy-relevant concerns. So basically, each of the authors here, each of the speakers has written a draft memo. A few have already come out, but basically we'll be rolling these out over the course of the next few weeks after the conference. And so your feedback here at these discussions will be very important as well in helping shape the final content of these memos. Just like I said, kind of the feedback element is very important. The conference is also organized to try and facilitate kind of short presentations so as to give privileged place to discussions among the panelists and the people in the audience who are your own experts in your own realms that have a lot to say about what we're doing. And conference, the breaks and the lunch breaks are also great opportunities for that. So one of the features of the conference is that while we have a general idea of what sorts of themes we want to emphasize, we put out a call for members to propose to us what they think the most important topics are that we should be researching. So this is not a case where the directors sort of invite people to speak on particular topics. Instead, we send it out to the large membership. We have about 130 members now, and they're the ones that are telling us what they think are important, and so they send proposals. So that's why, and then basically we try to organize the panels themselves among, to make them somewhat coherent, reflecting the different themes that have been organized. So that's sort of why, if people wonder why some topics are covered and not others, these are the topics that the academics are considering very important. But one of the key reasons for allowing a large amount of time, short presentations, and allowing a large amount of time for discussion is precisely so that we can hear from you what the questions are. So, your questions don't have to be directly on the topics of the memos, but if there's a memo on U.S.-Russian relations, I'm sure, for example, any of the panelists would have a lot to say on these topics as well. So let us know what interests you here. Just note that to encourage people, this is all, of course, on the record. There's a little handout there, as well as information there about social media. So we encourage you to post or be active in the discussions in that way as well. And so I think that is all that I wanted to say right now, other than just to once again thank IRES, our institute, the Elliott School, and of course Carnegie Corporation of New York for the funding that made all of this possible, and for the support over the years. And so with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague Marlene Laruelle, who I'm happy to say has recently been announced as the new director of our Institute of IRES. So take it away, please.
Thank you so much, Henry. Welcome everybody. I'm happy to chair the first panel that will be discussing Russia's soft, sharp power and the West. And we will have 3 speakers and a discussant. I will give 8 to 10 minutes to each speaker and 10 minutes to our discussant. And we will begin with Kimberly Marten from Columbia University discussing Russ-Afrique, Russia, France, and the Central African Republic. Let me also say that I will not read detailed bios of each of our speakers because you can find them printed. So Kim, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Henry and Marlene, and thank you all for joining us this morning. So the work that I'm presenting today comes out of work I've been doing for the past year and a half on Russia's Wagner Group and private military companies, semi-private private military companies. And I'm going to start today by posing a mystery that I need your help in solving. And the mystery is, what in the world is Russia doing in the Central African Republic? And let me present to you the knowledge that I have, and you can help me in the Q&A figure out what the answer is. So, the Central African Republic is a former French colony. France has always been heavily involved in security affairs there. Russia had no involvement whatsoever before 2017. There has been anarchy in the country since 2012 with militias fighting each other. And in 2017, the newly elected president of the Central African Republic, CAR, President Touadéra, a democratic-leaning technocrat, French-educated professor, asked the United Nations to lift the arms embargo on his country so that the state could get weapons to fight off the rebels that were challenging it. There was already a European Union training mission on the ground that was there under the UN peacekeeping auspices that was training the CAR military. France volunteered to donate 1,400 AK-47s that it had seized in a multilateral anti-piracy operation off the coast of Somalia. Everybody else on the UN Sanctions Committee thought that was a great idea. Russia vetoed it. Russia turned around and said, we'll donate our light weapons instead. And everybody on the Sanctions Committee agreed, it was unanimous, and then things turned weird. So, Moscow sent in 170 military advisors. It's gotten larger with time. There are now many more people than that from Moscow there. Almost certainly the people Moscow sent in were the Wagner Group. That's the group that Putin's friend, Yevgeny Prigozhin, has gotten the military contracts for. You all know him because he was the person who has been singled out by the United States as responsible for the 2016 U.S. election interference to the Internet Research Agency. He's also the contractor who was responsible for the infamous February 2018 incident in eastern Syria, where the Wagner Group ended up attacking U.S. forces in eastern Syria. So what did that group do when it got there? Well, some of them replaced what had been Rwandans who were serving as President Touadéra's personal security force. They were now all Russians. One of them, a retired Russian military intelligence GRU officer named Valery Zakharov, became the Central African State's national security advisor. So we think about our own national security advisor being replaced every once in a while. CAR replaced their national security advisor with a foreigner. So now President Touadéra is surrounded 24 hours a day by Russian security guards and people who have experience in the Russian intelligence services. Some of the people who came to the Central African Republic did special operations training of CAR forces. Unfortunately, they did it not in cooperation with the United Nations and not in cooperation with the EU training mission that was already on the ground. And that means they did it not in cooperation with international rules of engagement or internationally sanctioned human rights practices. And then many of the people who were sent in were sent to guard gold and diamond mines in CAR, where Prigozhin has a contract that was approved by the Russian state. So all of this happened basically since 2018. Russia also encouraged a separate ceasefire process in CAR from the United Nations. And they get credit for jump-starting things because the peace process wasn't working very quickly, and it did end up joining the United Nations and African Union peace process there because there was a lot of international pressure on them to do that. But the result of the Russian involvement was that you now have rebel militia leaders who have not been vetted and who have really no particular incentive to do any particular thing, now in a lot of very high-level government positions and military positions in CAR, moving much more quickly than would be standard in a typical situation where you have the integration of previous rebel forces. Meanwhile, Prigozhin started a smear campaign against France. He did it locally in CAR, and his motive would be clear because France is the one that's been putting the most pressure on him in the United Nations to bring his military training mission under UN auspices, and so he would have a reason to sort of, blame France for everything. But what's really interesting is that it wasn't just Prigozhin and his media folks that launched the smear campaign against France. There was also a smear campaign against France launched in the UN Security Council by the Russian representative there, Dmitry Polyansky. And I don't have time to talk to you right now about what it is because I'm being told by Marlene I have to hurry up. But in the question and answer period, I'm happy to go into the details of what that smear campaign was. So what we have throughout this is, there's this tendency by some people to think, oh, maybe it's just Prigozhin acting alone. It's not. On all these different points, on getting the contracts for the mining, on getting the agreement with Troitskiy to have the security forces come in, and what's been happening in the UN Security Council, he has very strong support from very high-ranking Russian state officials. So what in the world are Russian motives for doing this? Is it a reassertion of the Russian Cold War role in Africa? That's what Zaharov says. We were there in the Cold War and we're back. But the truth is the Soviet Union was never in CAR outside of some small educational programs. There were no prior interests, there were no prior security relationships before 2017, and CAR is this poverty-stricken place where the government only controls 20% of the territory. So why in the world would Russia be interested in CAR? Maybe it's somehow status-based. Maybe Russia realizes it's late to Africa, it wants to catch up with what the United States, the European Union, and especially China are doing in Africa, and maybe all the good locations are gone, and so CAR is one of the only ones left, and Russia has to take what's left, and so it goes into CAR because it wants to be in Africa, and that's what the choice is. Maybe that's what it is. Is it strategic? CAR is located in the geographical center of Africa, and Russia also has military agreements of one sort or another in a stripe that goes down from Libya and Egypt in the northeast to the Republic of Congo in the southwest, and Sudan is in between. And Prigozhin's group, the Wagner group, is also in Sudan, also with mining contracts, also with military training contracts. And so maybe if you look at this geographical stripe, maybe what Russia is trying to do is to repeat the French attempt to have a connection between the two ocean territories on either side of Africa, in this case the Mediterranean to the South Atlantic. What France tried to do and failed to do in the Fashoda incident of 1898. So it's possible that that's what Russia's trying to do, but if all Russia wanted was a military presence and some form of military access in the Central African Republic, it probably didn't have to go through all of these really strange unilateral actions that it's been doing since 2017. So I don't think that explains the whole thing. So that sort of leaves economics. Maybe it's Prigozhin, and we know that Prigozhin is connected to organized crime. We know that Prigozhin is connected to Putin, and maybe this is somehow Putin getting money through sort of illegal methods to help his regime. The problem is that those diamond and gold mines that Prigozhin has the contracts for are artisanal. And what that means is that they are mined by individuals holding sieves in pits that are dug 5 feet below the ground. So it's not this huge, mining thing that's going in and all this diamonds and gold are coming out. It's really, really small scale. There is some indication from United Nations reports that in the past couple of years, foreigners, including China, have been moving in with industrial scale mining equipment into CAR. Well, the problem there is that CAR has almost no infrastructure. So how in the world do you get that industrial equipment into CAR? I mean, basically, there are still French troops who are guarding the airport in CAR, because otherwise there'd be not even safe entry into the airport. Even if they manage to make them get in industrial, then there's no infrastructure, no roads, nothing to get them in and out. There's been a suggestion by a French scholar, Arnaud Kalika, that what is really going on is money laundering. And then the question is, why does Russia have to go all the way to the Central African Republic to launder money? So, nonetheless, the economic explanation would make it all fit. You need to cooperate with the state to get the mining and the export permits and to get the security forces in. You need to cooperate with the rebel militias who control the mining areas to get to the mines. You bring them together, and that pays the rebels off by giving them power in the capital that they wouldn't have had otherwise. And you get the diamond districts certified as conflict-free under the Kimberly process, which means that you can sell the diamonds there on the international market. And over the long run, Russia is indeed trying to invest in infrastructure. There are plans to build a railroad that would link the inner regions of Africa to the coast. So maybe it's possible that Prigozhin's plans are just really long-term. So that's my best answer, but you can maybe help me come up with other answers to this mystery of what in the world Russia is doing in the Central African Republic. And I would just like to end on one disturbing note. Russian unilateralism in the Central African Republic is really undermining what had been the possibility for the United Nations, the European Union, and the African Union to finally come up with a result where there would be positive economic and political developments in the Central African Republic. Russia is sending it backwards. So as we're trying to figure out the mystery of what Russia is doing, just remember that the people who are suffering the most are probably the citizens of the Central African Republic. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Kimberly. I would like now to give the floor to Şener Aktürk from Koç University in Istanbul, discussing the 5 faces of Russian soft power: far left, far right, Orthodox Christian, Russophone, and Ethnoreligious network.
Thank you very much, Marlene. Good morning, everybody. So my presentation and draft paper today on 5 faces of Russian soft power brings together already growing research on political parties and political networks that have a pro-Russian geopolitical, that favor a pro-Russian geopolitical identity in their countries. I am not, therefore, the one attributing or classifying most of these political parties and groups as having pro-Russian sympathies. That has already been done by the many scholars and journalists, some 25, 30 of which I cite in the paper, so I'm not the one in charge of the classification. I'm simply theorizing about the causes, consequences, and contradictions of these 5 categories of political networks and parties with pro-Russian geopolitical orientation or preferences. And these are, it should be clear from the presentation that these are, indigenous political parties that have had their basis in many cases, and in some cases, religious and sectarian groups that go back hundreds of years, which for various reasons that seem contradictory or opposed to each other do favor a more pro-Russian geopolitical identity. The premise of the research, premise of this paper and memo is that Russia's soft power is routinely underestimated, and I'm suggesting that it might be at least as great, if not even greater than Russia's hard power. Although military power, of course, is a necessary precondition of Russia projecting the soft power, but in a sense, I'm suggesting that Russia might be able to punch above its military economic capacity precisely because of these ideological and ideational appeals and sympathy it has among 5 seemingly contradictory categories of political parties and groups in Europe and beyond, but the focus is continental Europe as well, plus Britain here. I'm suggesting that therefore, these pro-Russian sympathies are not temporary, but structural and have long-term causes. They are not based on individuals. Much of journalistic accounts focus on a specific individual, let's say a pro-Russian businessman like Ivan Savvidis in Greece, etc. But even if you remove Savvidis entirely, it disappears tomorrow. The more structural, long-term causes of pro-Russian sympathy in Greece, both in the left and the right, will not disappear. And the same for Bulgaria, for France, for many of the countries that I am discussing here. Not discussing, just simply mentioning. And I'm also suggesting that much of the scholarship and journalism focus on the far right and the links between the far right and Russia, and that might be the most significant one, debatable, but it's not just the far right. I'm suggesting that there are at least 4 other different categories of political parties and political networks that also have pro-Russian sympathies, including the seeming opponents of far right, that is the far left. And finally, I am not, and these groups may overlap, right? An Orthodox Christian network might at the same time be a far-right group, might at the same time be, a Russophone group, etc. But they are nonetheless distinct. They do exist independently. And finally, I am not suggesting that it's necessary for any country to have such pro-Russian political parties or networks to be in government, in power, for that country to pursue a a foreign policy that favors, Russian intervention in Syria or opposes the sanctions. Countries might follow pro-Russian foreign policy purely on the basis of their, realpolitik, their calculation of self-interest. But what I am suggesting is the opposite, in the sense that the existence of these political networks and parties in government coalitions or in parliaments might be sufficient to actively, effectively block or veto policies that are against what many of us consider Russian aggression in Crimea and Syria. So blocking, sanctions against Russia, voting against Ukraine Association Agreement, vetoing, their country's intervention in Syria against Assad government, and so on and so forth. I can't go into too much detail for time constraints. So let's start with the far left. This is the first of 5. Here, the touchstone, the unifying theme seems to be that anti-imperialism is linked to a pro-Russian geopolitical identity. So, and here again, we can distinguish between at least 2 different kind of thin and thick kind of pro-Russian geopolitical identity. But usually, almost all of these far left groups see Russia as a counterweight against US-led pro-market capitalist world order. That is a more pragmatic, instrumental kind of view as to why they would oppose intervention in Syria or sanctions against Russia for its annexation of Crimea, or they, and so on and so forth. Yes, for example, leftist leaders such as Corbyn or Mélenchon in France, all of which are very significant electorally and otherwise, might simply, conceive of Russia as a counterweight, but there is a subset of far-left parties, such as Die Linke in Germany, or the KKE, the Communist Party of Greece, and so on and so forth, which have a more thick pro-Russian geopolitical identity based on perhaps historical path dependence, because their predecessors were pro-Soviet during the Cold War years, that the party, the East German Communist Party that evolved into PDS, the Party of Democratic Socialism that evolved into the Linke. So it's not, it's unsurprising that the Linke, the largest opposition party in Germany, would advocate, dissolving NATO and forming a new security alliance that includes Russia and Germany for a new European security environment. So one can distinguish between these two. Syriza so far has been the most significant in terms of electorally 35%, and assuming government in Greece for 4 years between 2015 and 2016. And it had consequences in the sense that, as previous research indicated, Greek members of the European Parliament alone voted in majority against EU-Ukraine Association Agreement in September. Both the far left, Syriza, and the Communist Party of Greece, and also the far right, the Golden Dawn and Independent Greeks, the coalition partner of Syriza. So when we turn to far right, the most studied pro-Russian network or group category, from Marine Le Pen's National Rally in France to Freiheitliche Partei Österreich in Austria, to Matteo Salvini's Lega Nord in Italy, to Alternative für Deutschland in Germany, you have a whole host of, and many others that I don't list here, Jobbik and Independent Greeks and so on and so forth, parties, all of which, these ones listed, all of which are against sanctions against Russia for the Crimean occupation. Many of them are also against either European Union and or NATO in the future. All of these groups, all of these far-right parties do share let's say, high dose of Islamophobia and anti-immigrant stance that is common to all of them. A subset of them, not all of them, so Islamophobia, yes, all of them share, but a subset of them also have a very strong anti-LGBT policy position or ideology, and they do, in that sense, they do resonate with pro-Kremlin ideological currents depicting Russia as the savior of a conservative family against quote-unquote gay Europa. And in that sense, so as anti-imperialism is the touchstone of the pro-Russian far left, Russia as the savior of white Christian European civilization appeals to the far right. Another category, now moving beyond political parties, would be the Orthodox and Christian networks, emblematic, symbolic in this sense would be Putin's visit to Mount Athos, the Orthodox Christian monastic network, Orthodox Vatican in Greece in May 2016, where he allegedly, not actually, but allegedly sat at the throne where only that was reserved for Byzantine emperors. I mean, this is, you could say it's a historic kind of pattern. Russia was the patron protector of all Orthodox Christians around the world, or at least, it claimed to be throughout the 18th, 19th centuries. It did intervene on behalf of every single Orthodox Christian uprising and independence movement against the Ottoman Empire, Bulgaria, Greece, Montenegro, Serbia, Romania, and we saw this most again this Orthodox Christian element vividly last year over the war of patriarchates, where the Moscow Patriarchate, the Russian Orthodox Patriarchate, strenuously lobbied against Istanbul Ecumenical Patriarch granting autocephalous independence, autonomous status to Ukrainian Church. And this struggle to claim the allegiance of Orthodox Christians around the world is continuing in a continental and global scale, where the Russian Patriarchate established the Exarchate of Western Europe in Paris, and France having the most number of Russian Orthodox believers. But sometimes it goes beyond just even Orthodox Christians. When Patriarch Kirill visits Brazil and Paraguay, he speaks about forming a common Christian front against secularization and liberal democracy ran amok and so on and so forth. How successful it is, I mean, you can read the testimonies, there are as well. It does raise some sympathy as, Russia, paradoxically perhaps, again, hospitable environment for this kind of conservative Christianity. So this will be my penultimate slide. Much smaller than the first three categories. One can speak of as a fourth category, the Russophone groups, not Slavic, not ethnically, but Russophone groups and pro-Russian ethnic sectarian networks. Russian Germans in Germany and Russian Jews in Israel would be two prominent examples. Again, somewhat surprising for me, it seems that Russian Germans have voted disproportionately for AfD and favor a more pro-Russian geopolitical identity. That was surprising for me. Similar as this weekend there is the Israeli national elections, and the last picture I'm going to show the headquarters of Likud with a big poster of Prime Minister Netanyahu shaking hands with Putin, because there is this idea that Russian Jews, 1/5 of Israeli Jewish voters, favor a more friendly relationship between Israel and Russia. So both Lieberman and Netanyahu are trying to move these voters. So Russian Jews. And finally, the fifth category would be some other ethno-religious sectarian networks that over decades have allied. It's my that for decades had the patronage or support of Russian military and state. That's why we see, again, journalistic and scholarly accounts speaking about a Russian Alawite or Orthodox Shiite alliance in Syria, or pictures of Hezbollah soldiers saluting, Orthodox Christian churches in Syria, trying to kind of give some visual support to this kind of alleged or purported alliance, and that's most obvious in the case of the Assad regime and its decades-long causal relationship with education, personal and so on and so forth with the Russian and before that Soviet state. So I don't think so. Causes and contradictory consequences of pro-Russian geopolitical identity groups, fiscally conservative, socially liberal, new political culture that has been the dominant, political culture. Liberal democratic West for the last quarter century or so does trigger resentment both on the far left and the far right, so that's not going to go away. But the fact that and also liberal internationalism triggers nativist reaction at the international level, so both of these domestic and international level causes are not going to go away. They are long-term structural. I don't think we'll talk about them even 10 years from now. But it's still somewhat contradictory and puzzling that Russia is able to latch onto these far left, far right, Orthodox Christian, Russophone resentments for the reasons that I listed here, because you would think these groups would also be equally opposed to Russia, precisely on these points, but they aren't. I can talk about them maybe in Q&A. I ran out of time long time ago, so thank you very much. I welcome your comments and questions, and if you don't have a chance to tell them now, you can also email me here. This is a collage of some of the figures that I mentioned throughout the memo and presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Şener. Our third speaker will be Mikhail Troitskiy from the Moscow State Institute of International Relations, discussing the limits of statecraft, comparing US and Russian views on the achievable in foreign policy.
Good morning. Thank you very much for coming. So my memo that is hopefully going to come out shortly is a think piece or speculation piece that plays with the notion of statecraft that I think is quite relevant these days to the foreign policies of both the United States and Russia and their mutual relationship. So in this discussion paper, I'm trying to formulate the paradox of statecraft in general terms and also then apply it to US-Russia relations. Now, statecraft is essentially a set of methods that one uses to achieve desired outcomes in desired goals in foreign policy. And statecraft is not just instruments, but it is rather specific combinations of instruments and time patterns of the use of those combinations. For example, you tend to, as a policymaker, as a statesman, you tend to issue threats and sanctions in order to up the ante, but then you offer negotiations. That's a statecraft. Or you use money to buy influence and domestically weaken the governments that you are dealing with in order to get what you want from those governments. Okay, another means of statecraft. Or you tend to leverage the ethical attraction of your position on key international issues, and that we just heard from Şener. So you leverage those, you leverage that ethical attraction and really support behind your moral cause, and thereby you achieve certain foreign policy goals. Okay, so at the end of the day, in the world that we have, what matters to others is not so much your intentions, that can always change, but your proven ability to achieve your goals. Right, and that is the effectiveness of your statecraft. So you begin hedging against someone, another actor in the international arena, not so much because you perceive someone as an adversary, but because that actor is thought to have mastered some new effective technique of statecraft. Right, so he is now in possession of a new capability that allows him or her to achieve the goals on behalf of his or her country. And so, okay, so what does all of that have to do with US-Russia relations? Indeed, those two actors, US and Russia, are different when it comes to available resources. There's, of course, great asymmetry, but they have usually thought of themselves as effective players, capable of setting goals and achieving those goals. In the US, you usually ask for a policy to deal with challenges, right? So there's an understanding that you can solve problems through purposeful action, as opposed to just, for example, waiting them out, or basically, leaving them as they are. Then the Russian policy-making tradition is more skeptical of anyone's ability to control outcomes, right? Something that the U.S. tradition of policy is very vocal about. So Russians like to emphasize the intractable complexity of the social world, the national traditions that supposedly often defy rational recipes for example, political or economic reform. So Russians are more skeptical about anyone's ability to control outcomes through statecraft. But nevertheless, over the last couple of decades, Russia has still been arguing that it has been able to maintain what it calls an independent foreign policy thanks to its ability to follow the footsteps of history, right? So following the footsteps of history, riding the wave of something, for example, multipolarity, can also be viewed as a statecraft technique that Russia believes is fairly effective. You don't, at the very least, it doesn't lead to overextension. Okay, and despite that confidence, mutual confidence in the effectiveness of statecraft, in the history of U.S.-Russia relations, we have had periods of statecraft scare, sudden upticks of concern with statecraft innovation by the opponent that was supposedly about to get the upper hand thanks to those statecraft innovations. And it is quite difficult to see how much that panic was unwarranted. You can think in terms of the domino theory or the early 80s war scare, the periods when one or the other party thought that the other one, the adversary, actually was about to deploy some very effective new means of statecraft. For example, decapitation, quick decapitation, surprise decapitation in the case of 1983 war scare. So it's kind of difficult to see how much that panic was warranted, and apparently it wasn't warranted back in 1983, as the historical record now shows. We just don't have, but we usually don't just have enough information about the intentions of the parties, about whether they were really in possession of this innovative statecraft, and whether they were really going to deploy it if they had a chance to do so. Okay, and now we are facing another such round of heightened concerns with the new effectiveness of mutual statecraft. And that currently, this period of statecraft scare has two aspects to it, two facets to it. First, the mainstream thinking on each side is critical of its own statecraft, but at the same time, it overestimates the opposite side's statecraft. It tends to overestimate the opposite side's statecraft effectiveness. So the United States, if you listen to mainstream pundits here in Washington and beyond, so the United States is supposedly failing to have its way, on everything, from trade with China to Iran nuclear deal to North Korea's missile and nuclear program, and so on and so forth. Right? But at the same time, these mainstream pundits suggest that Russia is succeeding in pursuit of its own supposed goals of weakening the United States, spreading its influence networks globally, and so on and so forth. Okay? And also, US punditry also appears to think that other nations, including China, Iran, North Korea, and others, are also succeeding in holding America back, right? And if you listen to the Russian pundits, you'd think that Russia is just only trying to defend itself from all sorts of provocations, it's just being reactive, but then it's facing allegations, unfair allegations of many things, like involvement in US politics, and that is very unfair, and that manifold tactics are being deployed against Russia in order to deny it the right to govern itself the way it wants to. Okay, so both sides appear to be critical of their own statecraft while overstating the effectiveness of the other side's statecraft. And secondly, this first factor is being compounded by increased mutual fears of subversion, and those fears largely result from rapid growth in innovative technology, including artificial intellect, IT, big data. The impact of that technology on statecraft is still unclear, so supposedly breakthroughs in the effectiveness of statecraft on both sides can happen anytime, and that gives that is another source of concern with statecraft. So we are now faced. So what we are now faced with is the U.S. and Russia fearing that the limits of the achievable for the other side are actually broader than they might think, right? And such scare has plenty of implications for the bilateral relationship, and in the minute that that I have, I'm just going to address a couple of implications that indeed go beyond that relationship between the United States and Russia. It affects all the international relations of both sides. So, for example, all bilateral negotiations between the United States and Russia are now conducted in the shadow of concerns with mutual vulnerabilities that can supposedly be exploited if one of the sides overlooks some loopholes in the negotiated deals, right? So the stakes are high. You cannot rely on those deals to last in a situation of expected rapid upgrades in statecraft, right? And deal making in such a situation becomes really hard. Not so much because of matters of principle and values, but because the sides are too careful not to be lulled into a losing position, right? And more specifically, and that's my final point, one clear casualty of the statecraft flux is the concept of strategic stability, which underpins most of the US-Russia arms control. So some emerging statecraft capabilities and techniques are now being viewed almost as deadly as nuclear weapons, right? Because they can be supposedly used just to subvert governments or even dismantle regimes. So you want to include everything now under the rubric of strategic stability, not just the lack of incentive to use nuclear weapons, which is the classical, the core understanding of strategic stability. And that effectively results in a stalemated or even collapsing arms control. You are too worried not to overlook some surprise statecraft technology, so the sides want to keep their hands untied to respond. So that's basically the paradox of statecraft that I wanted to address, the fact that mutual skepticism about one's own statecraft with overstated statecraft capabilities of the other side lead to stalemates in negotiations, especially those on arms control. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mikhail. Now I would like to give the floor to our discussant, Ambassador Rubin, who has been serving the region in the diplomatic corps for years and who is now president of the American Foreign Service Association.
Thank you very much. Very glad to be here, and I think I've been coming to PONARS for at least 20 years since the beginning, so it's great to be back. I'm here primarily not because of my new job at the American Foreign Service Association, but because I've just come back from 3.5 years as ambassador to Bulgaria, and all of the themes that we just discussed, that Kimberly, Şener, and Mikhail discussed, are things that I think are very relevant to looking at what Russia is doing and how it is trying to craft its approach. The biggest takeaway that I have coming from my time in Bulgaria is that at the end of the day, it may be a cliche, but I think it's true, that it really is not a grand plan. Russia is acting to fill gaps and to take advantage of opportunities and doing things, I think, that sometimes seem unusual, but at the end of the day make sense in terms of taking what really is not a very strong hand. And Bulgaria is a good example of that. There's obviously a historical tie, and the sort of stereotype of Bulgaria is of a country that owes so much to Russia historically and has deep cultural connections. There's really not that much there, but the Russians are very skillfully taking advantage of what is there, which includes the indoctrination that Bulgarian school children get starting in first grade about Russia as liberator and 500 years of slavery under the Ottomans. And you have this very unusual situation in which Bulgaria, probably having the strongest ex-communist party in the region, which is more communist nostalgic and Soviet nostalgic than really any of the other parties in Central Eastern Europe, have essentially been captured by pseudo-Russian nationalist themes and an effort by the Russian services to use those historical themes. And so, as one of my Bulgarian friends put it, you have people who don't believe in God preaching religion to people who don't believe in God. And that's basically what's going on. This isn't real religion, it's not actually real cultural connection, but it's a very effective use of soft power. And it fills a gap, and I think the most important point I would make is none of this would be happening if there were confidence in NATO and the European Union. And when Bulgaria and the other countries in the region made their fundamental civilizational commitment to NATO and the European Union, it was not only sincere, I think it was wholehearted. And what we're seeing now is anxiety over whether that choice was correct and whether it will be enduring and whether it will protect these societies. And certainly in the case of Bulgaria, the Russians have taken advantage of that by constantly pumping out messages designed to enhance insecurity, to say you made the wrong choice, just look how well it's going, don't have a chance to go back. The Russians are not saying that there's a chance to undo it, but basically the message is you chose wrong and you're going to be sorry, and maybe you want to at least come back to us a little bit and talk to us. The narratives are not really genuine, and again, fundamentally what I've seen is KGB successor agencies using Russian historic national themes, which they almost certainly don't believe in, but they have some effectiveness. And that includes the Pan-Slavism, it certainly includes the church, which is exceedingly weak in Bulgaria and in many of the other countries, but still has a historical legitimacy that nothing else has. And so I think that's really important. But the gap-filling thing is really important, which is why I think it's so essential to not leave those gaps, to not enhance the insecurity of countries that have made that choice. And I think the focus will always be, from the Russian point of view, to take advantage when they can. And so, I think all of our panelists today have touched on pieces of that, but that to me is the most important thing that I take away.
Thank you so much, Ambassador.